Welcome to my Acharei Mot Kedoshim Devar Torah. Why we can't receive rebuke anymore. There's something I've been thinking about this week from my own childhood. Even in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the communities I grew up in were deeply interconnected. People didn't just live near each other, they lived with each other in a real sense. You were seen, you were known, and you were corrected by more than just your parents. I remember being told by my grandmother not to run in my Shabbat dress. Of course, I didn't listen. I ran, I fell, and I still carry the scar on my knee to this day. I tore my new pink Shabbat dress, ruined my brand new Mary Jane's, and came home covered in dirt and blood. And I remember what happened next. News traveled fast. My grandmother knew almost immediately. And in a world like that, it wasn't surveillance, it was community awareness. People noticed, people responded. But there was also rebuke. I remember the adults speaking to me with seriousness, not humiliation, not performance, but clarity. The kind of tone that said, "This matters." And I remember the words, "We'll talk about this at home." It was immediate, it was grounded, and it still carries weight today. And there were consequences, not excessive, but real. I was corrected at home in a way that made the moment stick. I had to take off my beautiful ruined Shabbat dress and put on my scratchy polyester dress instead. At the same time, I also remember the other side of that moment. The same neighborhood life. Older boys were throwing bottles against the sidewalk in front of the houses. Something every child knew not to do. That glass is what I eventually slipped on. But even there, the system of community response worked. The behavior was seen, addressed, and corrected quickly by the adults in the area. There was no spectacle, there was no delay. The consequences were swift, appropriate, and understood by everyone involved. So I grew up with a very specific understanding of community. It wasn't perfect, but it was present. It wasn't always gentle, but it was responsible. Not absent of correction, but structured by it. And I think that tension is exactly where Acharei Mot Kedoshim speaks to us. Because when the Torah says, "Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha, hochiach tochiach et amiteka," you shall not hate your brother in your heart, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor, Leviticus 19:17. It is not describing abstract morality. It's describing social reality in which people are responsible for one another's behavior, not in theory, but in practice, where actions are seen, where responses are expected, and where correction is part of belonging, not separate from it. And when I place that next to what the rabbis say in Talmud Arakhin 16b, that rebuke is one of the most difficult mitzvot, and that even in their own time, they questioned whether people truly knew how to do it well. I hear something important. The Torah assumes rebuke is necessary. The rabbis assume it is difficult. And between those two truths, we are asked to live. But because the challenge is not whether we see wrongdoing, we always have. The challenge is whether we still know how to respond to one another in a way that builds rather than breaks community. And yet, if we are honest, something else has changed. Because it is not only that we struggle to give rebuke well, it is also that we struggle to receive even the smallest form of correction or boundary. A few days ago on YouTube, I came across a video of a woman being asked at a Costco exit to present her receipt. Something any Costco member knows is part of the process. The employee was doing what they are trained to do, a simple, polite check at the door. In the video, the situation escalated in a way that was deeply jarring. The situation became far more tense than the moment required. What stayed with me was the mismatch between a routine boundary and an extreme reaction to it. And what makes it even more striking is that in this case, there was no indication of wrongdoing or theft. It was simply a refusal to be told what to do in a public space, even when nothing improper had occurred. Now, I can say this with a bit of humor as a loyal Costco customer. I have no intention of jeopardizing my membership, and I have been through that exit line many times. There is nothing really confrontational about it. It is usually a quick glance, a polite smile, and a smiley-faced receipt handed back to you as you leave. And yet, the question still lingers. What has happened to us that even a small, ordinary act of verification can feel like an intrusion of identity rather than a routine part of shared space? That question brings me back to the Torah in another way. Because Leviticus does not only say, rebuke your neighbor, it also says, Lifnei aver lo titen mishko. Do not place a stumbling block before the blind. The rabbis understand this in Sifra not only as physical harm, but also as moral responsibility. Do not mislead. Do not reinforce confusion. Do not take advantage of vulnerability. In other words, speech is never neutral. What we say, or what we fail to say, shapes someone else's reality. And the Mishnah adds its own restraint in Mishnah Avot. Ha'chaim hisaru be'divrachem. Sages, be careful with your words. Because wisdom is not only measured in what we know, but in how carefully we bring what we know into the world. And the mystical tradition goes even further. In the Zohar, speech is not just communication, it is creation. Words do not only describe reality, they form it. Kol daber oseh roshem. Every word leaves an imprint. So when we speak, especially when we correct one another, we are not just exchanging information. We are shaping the world someone else will inhabit, which brings us back to where we began. We live in an age of overwhelming speech, but not necessarily responsible speech. We are fluent in reaction, but less fluent in relationship. We are skilled at broadcasting, but less skilled at conversation. So perhaps the avodah of Kedoshim, Tihu, you shall be holy, in this moment is not to become louder or more certain, but to become more careful, more present before we speak, more responsible for what our words create, more willing to stay in relationship long enough for a truth to actually be heard. Because Torah does not only command rebuke, it commands a way of rebuking that preserves the possibility of community. And that, perhaps, is one of the most difficult mitzvah we are learning how to live.